how many years now? 9, 10 years? We've been going with the Robert Frost Celebration of American Poetry here. I'd like to welcome everyone back. It's National Poetry Month. We have a lot of people interested in poetry, a lot of people who write poems here. Current Poet Laureate of the state of Wisconsin is just dashed across the state to get here. Own illustrious Dorothy Chan, who's coming out with books just as fast as they can be printed, is here as well. And many other people who have been here before or just here to honor, maybe not even just Robert Frost, but to make a gesture towards the importance of poetry and maybe thoughtful language with depth and passion, but more than passion, compassion, that is all too rare in our contemporary political and cultural discourse. I'm Max Garland, by the way. Taught here for a long time, and I first encountered Robert Frost, the living image of Robert Frost, not in the flesh, but on television in 1961 at the inauguration of John F. Kennedy. And I mentioned that, like millions of other people. I was watching it. They let us watch that in school. And so here outside in Washington, D.C., an incredibly close and contentious election. B.J. Hollers has written about Wisconsin's part in the Kennedy nomination and such. So there they are. There's the young, about to be the young new president. There's Dwight Eisenhower, the outgoing president. There's Richard Nixon, the fierce opponent of Kennedy's, sitting there. Their wife, Lyndon Johnson, right next. But before we can hear from any of those people, here comes, of all things, a poet. Now, I don't know if I knew at 11 there were still, I didn't know when I was 11, I knew there were still living poets. I knew they once existed, but here was one. Now, to be quite frank about it, during the reading, it looked like Frost might actually cease to be alive. I don't know. I'm nothing against him. He's a wonderful, important poet, but he had a little trouble. He was in his mid-80s. He had, lived a long, busy, very tragic life in terms of his family. And he had written a new poem to deliver at Kennedy's inauguration. Big, long poem. And it was extremely bright. The paper he had, I think, was onion skin, and it was blowing around, and he had trouble controlling it. And the wind was blowing. And so he started reading this poem, and then he would stop, and then a page would go this way and that way. And it was like, and you knew there are people who do a lot of work to organize events like this, but these people were they were organizing an event to usher in the new leader of America. And in a time of great crisis, the Cold War was just, about to flare up at any minute. And so they thought, oh, and Kennedy was a good friend of Robert Frost. He knew many Robert Frost poems by heart. Robert Frost was not afraid to give advice to the president before he was a president. And so, but I'm pretty sure the organizers of the event, and maybe some in the audience, thought, okay, this is going to be the end of the tradition of having a poet speak at an inauguration, or he's going to die. And so Lyndon Johnson got up and took his top hat and tried to shade the pieces of paper for Frost to read the poem. And that didn't really work, and he was getting kind of frustrated, and everyone was getting nervous. Jackie Kennedy was sitting right over to his right, and she had a very concerned look on her face. I didn't know at the time, or maybe I don't know why I didn't think of that. I was 11. I thought of myself. She had lost a child just months before that, herself, her third child. And Frost finally just said, no. He just brushed everyone away, and he recited a famous poem of his by heart, and which maybe is what he should have done in the beginning. And so there it went. It went on. Every Democratic president since then has had an inaugural poet. None of the other side have ever had one. I don't know. You can make your own conclusions about that. But so that was an interesting thing. So two things. The reason I'm mentioning that. One, here was an election in which the Democrats had won by 118,000 votes. The popular vote was 48.7% for Kennedy, 48.5% for Nixon. The closest election you could possibly imagine. It was 118,000. And yet, here was Nixon, here was Eisenhower, here they all were. They were sitting there like grown-ups. And I thought, oh, wow. Now, I remember in more recent history, an election in which there were 7,057,000 vote victory. And according to my native state, Kentuckians, long-running Senator Mitch McConnell, it was not a very close election. I mention all this not to stir up politics, but just as an 11-year-old, here's what I thought. These people hated each other, but they didn't hate the country. This must be what democracy is. You try hard, you win, you step forth to do the job in a dangerous time. You lose, you congratulate the other person. That's what being grown up is. That's my first lesson. That's what I remember from 1961. The other thing I remember is a poet must be pretty important if before any of these other people speak, the poet is called up to speak. Now, inaugural poems, as I can attest to, are hard to write. I actually was called upon in this very university, and they're not often done well. But there was no doubt that Robert Frost at that time was the national poet. He had written and he was a late bloomer. I think it was in his late 30s when his first book came out, and not here. They were in England. He came back. So he'd been writing a long, long time, but he was late in coming to in publishing. You might read a Frost poem today and think it's not very contemporary language or colloquial or spoken language, but compared to Tennyson, John Greenleaf Whittier, Longfellow, it's really chiseled down and carved down. Also, oddly enough, you can read autobiographical moments in it, but for someone who lived a life which involved such personal tragedy, he tended to write a lot about other people from other voices. And the point of his poetry, what he really went for is voice. He went for sound, he went for voice. He said, he became, immensely famous. I tried to count up, and I think I found 15 or 16 states that have Robert Frost elementary or junior high schools in them. There's one, my favorite detail from investigating that, I went to a John Greenleaf Whittier school, an elementary school. There are Maya Angelou schools, Phyllis Wheatley schools. There are lots of Thoreau School in Madison. There's a Longfellow school here that some of you may have gone to. So that's another thing. Kids think, oh, that's important. They name schools after people like this. But what he said about his ambition was that he hoped to write a few poems that would be hard to get rid of. I'm hoping to do that someday, possibly too. Let me find and I got into Frost, reading everything I could about him. And one thing I just would like to leave you, if you want to read one of the more eloquent public speeches advocating for freedom of speech and the arts and the status of the artists and writers, read or listen to John F. Kennedy's speech in 1963 when he dedicated the Robert Frost Library at Amherst, I think it was. This was 27 days before John F. Kennedy was killed. And he talked about how he hoped that the status and the rewards that we give to artists and poets and writers will someday be equivalent to what we give to leaders and people who are successful in business, in statecraft. And he said the job of an artist is not to write propaganda, it is to be true to themselves, even if it's not agreeable to those around, to those in power even. And it was a speech better than I could have made about the power of art and who a poet finally had to be true to. And so it's readily available, you know, and particularly poignant since it's the last really beautiful or important speech that that Kennedy gave before he died. So I picked enough Frost poems to last a couple of hours. And that would be a very bad idea. So I'm going to read a very unseasonable poem. I'm not even going to read it. I'm going to see if I can remember it. And there's a reason. Another thing Frost liked to do is he liked to correct people when they thought they knew what his poems meant. Sometimes I think he was sincere. Sometimes I think he was just messing with people, you know. The road not taken. No, everybody misunderstands that, you know, he said, and those kind of things. But this is probably one of the poems of Frost that is pretty hard to get rid of. It's one of them. It seems like it might be corny, but some good things are. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening. All right. And let me see, what else I want to say about this. I've heard Frost read this poem many times. He did it in a more you know, he did it sort of as if he's incanting these things, as he's pronouncing, speechifying them a little bit. He wanted to make sure that this is poetry, but I'm going to try to read it in a more conversational way. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. Between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year, he gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds, the sweep, the easy wind, and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, miles to go before I sleep. Miles to go before I sleep. I'm not going to interpret that poem for you. Every school child has had their shot at that. My favorite take on this poem is in season 4 or 5 of Sopranos, when AJ is struggling in his English class and he tries to get his sister to explain this poem. He uses an obscenity about it. He can't understand it. What does it mean? What does it mean? And she says, well, you know, it's white, it's falling, it's death. The woods are lovely, dark and deep. And AJ said, but I thought dark was death. Well, no, white too is death. And he just said he was so frustrated at himself. But yeah, a poem read for a lesson is not a poem. It's what my friend William Stafford once said. But anyway, it is a beautiful poem, and the cadences of it imitate what is happening in the poem. Some of the rhymes are in-stopped, some are not. He wanted his poems to be heard. He memorized most of them. The reason he thought rhyme was a very convenient way for a poem to stick in your mind. And of course, there are many other ways. So I was going to, before I introduce other guests here, let me see if I can. I'd like to, most of all, I forgot to welcome Ms. Chris Joan Christopherson Schmidt, who has come across the state, who is responsible, along with some other people in this room, for bringing of this Frost archive, some of which is in the very back there. First edition, signed editions. We have handwritten poems by Robert Frost and all of these things, which I think maybe might make this person we see in old school books a little bit more real to others. But speaking of corny poems, I brought my only daffodil today in my garden, which they started to bloom about 2 weeks ago, and then it snowed and all of that, and they just crossed their little petals and said, no, not. That's the first one to come back. And so I'm going to see if I can remember a poem that someone left me a handful of daffodils once. It's a pretty old poem. And it made me think back to when I was in the 5th grade. And I was selected king of the 5th grade. It's a horrible thing that we do to kids. King of 5th grade queen. And I was very short, little kid. I didn't look much like a king. The queen, Brenda Hatfield, was very, very, very tall, as 5th grade girls sometimes are compared to their little guys who have to escort them. Those daffodils reminded me of that moment. Oh, also, if this is streaming, which I think it is, her name was Brenda Hatfield. And in Kentucky, you have to be careful what you say about people named Hatfield or McCoy, but I mean no harm, no disrespect at all. And also Audrey Hepburn is mentioned. I know Dorothy is an expert in movie icons of the 60s and long before that. We've discussed that before. I compare the height of Brenda Hatfield to Audrey Hepburn, who I call tall. I know she wasn't actually tall, but to a 5th grade boy, she was tall. Because you gave me a handful of daffodils, I thought of Brenda Hatfield, queen of the 5th grade, a very thin, shy girl, almost as tall as Audrey Hepburn, but blonde. She wore a dress based upon the principle of the daffodil. Puffed sleeves, inflated bodice, profusion of frills along the shoulder blades and hemline. A dress based upon the principle of girl as flower. Everything unfolding, spilling outward and downward, ribbon, stole, corsage, sash. Even the scent of the daffodils you left reminds me. It was a spring night, and escorting her down the runway was a losing battle, trying to march down the full, thick folds of crinoline into the barrage of her father's flash bulbs, wading the backwash of her mother's perfume, scared, smiling, tiny, down at the end of that long, thin Audrey Hepburn arm, where I was king. So I'm presenting my only daffodil to Miss Chris in honor of her great gift to our university. And then I'm going to get out of the way by introducing the current poet laureate, who's just sped across the state. Nick Gulig, who went to school here, has deep, deep roots in this neighborhood. I grabbed from my bookcase as I was coming out, though we're not selling books necessarily today, beautiful book of Nick's. I also grabbed the last book of Dorothy Chan, who's going to read later, that I could find on my bookcase. And so I'll just, Nick is, poems are deep, thoughtful. I so hope that Nick is enjoying his tenure as poet laureate. I know that you find yourself in a lot of situations where you have to improvise a lot and you're called upon to say a lot of things, and it's hard to say what's true and deep and yet what is maybe accessible or even possibly at times flattering to the people who are in front of you. And so it's an interesting thing. I think it's been valuable to me. But I'm glad you're doing it now. A wonderful poet and person who's coming back home to give us some news from his own insights, his own poetic insights. Please welcome Nick Gulig.
It's like confused how things are being. Thanks for coming. It's good to be back in Eau Claire. As I was walking over here from my mom's house, which is just about 2 blocks that way, I was remembering my first semester as a college student. I took 1 semester here at Eau Claire, took my first poetry class with Bruce Taylor, got a B. My dad worked in the theater department here most of his life. And so I grew up running around, I spent my summers running around this campus. I walked over here with my kids and I was showing them the creek that's behind us. And I spent most of my summers with a butterfly net pulling minnows out of that creek. So it's nice to be here. I just have 3 poems. One's short, one's a little less short, and one's long. The first poem is called Book of Talk. To live again, we choose a language. Use it early in the aftermath of evening's spinning records. Do our instruments instruct us? Tell us everything we've lost returns to us through shade. To speak again, we shoot the books we love upon a wooden spindle placed behind your house. Spell the disappearance of a word both in the world and from it, sounding far. It's beginning to be that time again. The snow in isolated flecks across the yard arrives. Another year in this, the somehow middle of a life gone by too quickly. Home is where we're here again. A song we've learned by living it, even when we leave. Wisconsin glistens in its insistence. The crawl of seasons like a lover's breath, and everything I wish that I could sing to keep our better years abreast arises through me with the quickness of a wrist pulse. What I mean to say is yes. Desire is a room unto itself. The stairs are crooked, and the stars that light the floor are leaking, spilling liquid in the lacquered dark. Even the low moon's dress hung out to dry with nothing in it, frays its alabaster threads beyond the distant glowing of the house. The world is busy, making room for ghosts, and everything I've said to them returns to me unmade. Let us wait to pray until the words pronounce themselves without us, and the snow accumulates around our ankles like a halo lowered through the only light there is to know another person by. Someday soon, our kids will stand where we do, telling stories of the days their fathers talked for hours over music, the high notes flickering like an absent faith come back to guide us through its wake. Grief remembers everything. The dark is old. The songs that we've exchanged preserve our listening in rooms. Somewhere else, you're making beautiful mistakes, and I believe you. Love is thunderous. Our voices winter like a memory in which the both of us are younger. The struck expression of our faces escaping through a painting of a window on a wall. BJ, where's BJ? Is he still here? No. BJ is this incredibly, not sure if BJ is real. He's always up. Those of you who know, I'm sure a lot of you know BJ, he's always up to something. He reached out back during the pandemic, and he was putting together an anthology of Wisconsin poets writing about the pandemic. And BJ's like, I need you to write something. And I always say yes to BJ just because he does so much. He's impossible to say no to. And I was teaching a class on Emily Dickinson at the time, and you'll hear Dickinson make her way into this pandemic poem that I wrote for BJ's book. It's called Hope is a Dark Flock Rising. In Dickinson's 3:14, the poet turns her hope into a bird. I'm almost 40. Because they've started coming back, I imagine this desire blurs into a horned lark. It's February cold, and local outlets announce the presence of the virus in Wisconsin. Such is the power of metaphor. According to reports, the patient walked alone into a hospital. My body slows into its history. In periods of lasting isolation, the theory of allopatric speciation contends that over time, some birds phenotypically respond to their geography. How are you doing? My daughter writes in a letter to her friend. Separating species, this variance in habitat demands a new vocabulary. Their symptoms were consistent. In the open field between an object and its import, language clutches with its ghost hand at the air. Metaphors conflate. For Dickinson, the bird that hope becomes is either prior to or after speech, a thing with feathers that perches in the soul. These symptoms include recurrent coughing, fever, and fatigue, and endless inner singing. Often the body aches and does so deeply, a pain that lasts for days and echoes in the muscle and the bone. At first, I paid no mind. If birds of the same type are kept apart for long enough, they cease to see themselves in others of their kind. Their common song no longer a reunion. In some cases, the lips and face turn blue from lack of oxygen. The song moves in and out of us, spreading exponentially. In a post-pandemic world, the exchange between a symbol and its referent now requires the strange catastrophe of breath, what Dickinson calls a storm. Not long before their fever, the patient had been to see their family. Hope, it seems, cannot be parted from the maelstrom. My thirst thought, if I remember, was not a thought at all. I heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea. A blue silence rose within me. Every day at 3:00 precisely, the children in my neighborhood stand alone in separate driveways and yell each other's names across the boulevard. My faith in art is that the bird exists as an insistence and can and will disrupt the context of its singing, its small voice passing through an air we now imagine poisoned. Crossing continents and oceans, One presumes the patient had wanted to see the faces of their loved ones, to be a form held tight against another. I too desire to be a form held tight against another. Every night, I grab a can of beer from my refrigerator and talk nostalgic with my friends. The virus is a line of air connecting us to people we'll never meet, whose names occur in languages we'll never speak. Our tongues are dark, our lungs are ravenous. The Department of Human Services is operating with an abundance of caution. We are older now and lonely. The existence of extrinsic barriers obstructs the call-like variance of our transmissions. It is difficult to think of hope in Dickinson's work without remembering that when I read it, I find myself beside myself, unspooled in a different wilderness. As if for the first time, we are learning how to see each other, our faces glitched and framed by our computers. It's getting difficult. Often her language falls apart. The frequent dashes suturing the starts and stops of fragments, a kind of calling out from deep within the terror of a pause. The patient is being monitored. In moments of extremity, the song arrives as if the storm had beckoned it. Dear Cubby, my daughter writes, I wish that we could play. Here, where no one is themselves, we're telling the story over, night by night. The first death, then the second. Our language loosens in the air. The friend my daughter writes to is the daughter of a man I've known since we were children. So when they set their letters in the mailbox, it feels like we do too. Our history returning across the landscape, a time and place no longer present, moving through our kids. All of us are breathing. The structure of our lungs expands to house the living remnants. My daughter stares beyond the window. Here in Wisconsin, the first returning migratory birds perch on the snow-bright stalks of goldenrod. Sheltered though we are, our hope is that in which we speak to stitch ourselves together. Dickinson was wrong. This requires everything. The patient is now at home. Months before it's spring, the horned larks gather in dark flocks, picking through the ice and stubble, searching for hidden seeds. This is their geography. When frightened, the flock alights as one, a single entity twisting swiftly, their lisping call notes disappearing in the half-imagined distance of their song. So this, the last one I'm going to read is a poem called Book of Lake, and it's kind of the last major poem in the manuscript I'm working on right now, which is called The Other Altar. It begins with an epigraph by my first kind of extensive poetry teacher was a poet named Joanna Klink at the University of Montana. It begins with a line from one of her poems, which is, "If there is a world, let me be in it." Book of Lake. In increments, the book became itself beyond itself. As when the world was water swept, the words dissolved among the reeds and litter wrapped around the wind as well, the lake comes spooling inward like a discourse. Promised through the air is overwrought and not released. Calamities of almost metal insects clicking in the bright halls we have forgotten, the painted rock of walls that we are not ourselves. Every time the book begins, again, the house that I've become collapses. Erupted off the tangible, a mind, a favorite sky, a future. These are the shapes of clouds adrift against the mountain, a wilderness of difference, a sentence. undone among the constellated mess, evening, kingdom, flame, upon the myriad of rooftops, would that one could suffer further inward and recover, as if the diagnosis didn't matter, the way it isn't summer. What kind of finite, what kind of absolute bouquet? Parenthetical, an amphora of light conceived as if the act of seeing were enough. Myth and bioluminescence, as children prone to press the brightness out, we painted. The images existing, images exist. I want to show you everything. The hardest part is parsing out and speaking. Dust collected on the plastic jacket of the book, reconstructed into logic, resurrected into swell. The road that splits the shore in half, down which the trees are beetle burrowed, dropping shade. A lake I am that you surround me now that the interior reflects. Not catastrophe so much as failure in the sense of being orderly. And so I say the landscape is my opposite. And so what is it that I mean? A sense of the extravagant, this path of matted grass between the trees erases me. Despite the book and of it, a love of wilderness and not the place itself. The startled deer, because they dragged their antlers through, canceled and are kept. The far idea in tune and out of order. Immediate the hills in increments. I wanted every mineral to stay in place, the anti-ontological in which an absolute catastrophe. Disfigured into symmetry while I was thinking, a landscape rendered into asking, into ache, paging slowly through the book, both does and doesn't help this drift. Beyond a garden rising in September, wanting to reach out, I clasped my hands around a weapon's wooden handle. The field was all around me, terror lit. The water seemed approachable. More than anything, you said, the inner deriving magnitude, the hour. In the middle distance, believing something that I couldn't, infant curl of fern. Our bodies missing not intelligence so much as argument, inter-elemental, does one thing and the same, is not dissimilar exactly. Gleaned and or dismissed, the fraying edges, aster in the shattered chaff, milkweed, burning nettle, the story goes, I need you, cannot not talk, although we have decided to become. Abrupt solidity, and then to still continue to describe. An inscape interrupted. Therefore, the field grew up around me like an empire, casting out across the pages of my body images of grass, but not the grass itself, the weight that thinking bore, flooded over. The river then is absolutely relevant, although it is impossible. Dragged the bottom, as though a thought can only almost touch it. A shore of trees emerging out of witness, out of having the ability, the leaves in motion make the motion up, single mind of the leaf, the stem, the branch in water, winter, a sky gone, the gray blue, evening bird, less distance, mind of the horizon interrupting, pitch and auburn north, the light has startled out his left. Today, the nightbirds interrupted off the fence post between one place where you are and another. After harvest, after seed, We are not together as the single oak outside the house begins to empty, and we are not together when it fills. Every distance has been rendered. The days are absolute. When I walk into the yard, a multiplicity of insects flick their little lights insistently. I flicker back. Against the early dark, I plant the desperate parts. Forgive me. As the river lowers, as the sumac reddens like a warning, the weather, good or bad, reverses every rage. Both is and isn't happening, this. Larkspur in the far field, bending, belladonna writhing in the grass. Afterwards, an open space between the separated pistils, the sun against the gravel, rounded underwater, an octave lower, there is something verifiable to locate. Yes or no, too pretty to believe you, spirit. The first word, not the second. I'm gutting out the garden. Take me closer to the lake. In the direction of the lake, I take you closer. Together we submerge our wrists, the shoreline lessening, leaving sand. In the lake, we turn to water there beneath. We river under, deepening the water, warmer than I remember, moves when we remove our politics. The other day I said your name and very little happened. This winter I've been singular. I stand sometimes in rooms where very little happens. What I mean, I think, is yes, the trees are growing circular, the level of the water lower. I owe you more than I am able to erase. Forgive me if I have failed to follow perfectly the line of sight gone out above and not below me. Snow is what a zero does. Take me there, and I will show you how, with little effort, to vanish through its center. Spelled and or distressed, the shallows waded into, I could almost see the wind, could feel it changing on the lake, its surface turned to writhing, turned upon the shore. My heart gave out, gave nothing back. I swallowed hard. The air came in and left me. The air came in and left me. I had wanted love. I wanted love, I thought, to ruin it without you meant within me nothing less. The far off sound prolonged in droves, approaching circular, a zero hung, a garland, yes, around my neck, in ice, lit boughs of needles, threading silver I could not dissolve completely in you, though from far away in this defeat, inaccurate with both my eyes, I tried to echo back the stirring earth within, the imprint left behind to tell the story clearly. Life has happened here. It can't return. The shape of fields we slept alone inside of, thinking how and for and what, for who could not exist unless in aftermath the bluer light was splayed upon our bodies, pulling water there from the interior. A sea of green and black in both our eyes. Our mouths were tightly wrapped in mourning. Vines could not believe the waves the unshored water offered. Through to think we could, and maybe stress the matter further past ourselves, the other matter waking now, the field, the almost singular in which to still believe the name you gave to me, material in winter more, the world that comes together. In your wake, you drone behind you, leaving at the edges of the shade your form. It isn't clear to see from this position stranded. I am tracing also here the face of stones, the sound of which in snow your eyes release the ground as I recall. Thank you.
Happy National Poetry Month, and thank you everyone for being here today. Because it is National Poetry Month, I think that it is all the more important for me to honor my community as well as my poetry family. The first poem that I'm going to read today is titled Somehow, and it is for and about my late great poetry father, Norman Doobie. Norman really was like a father to me. And for the past year and a half, I've been grappling a lot with loss and grief, and also taking all of these emotions that are very complex and complicated back to Chinese belief. And in Chinese belief, we believe that if a loved one passes away and they visit us in a dream, that that dream is actually real and they are communicating to us. Somehow, for Norman. You visit me in a dream after passing, after I've been awaiting you for weeks, because Chinese belief teaches us our loved ones will appear when we're asleep. It's real when I enter the hotel restaurant in the middle of nowhere town I live in, as the Midwest architecture transforms into Kowloon at evening time. We eat bird's nest soup, and I remember the time my father ordered me this 400-year-old delicacy at Hong Kong airport. Out comes the Peking duck, and I ask you, why did it take you so long? You answer, I arrived once you were strong and ready. And speaking of family, I just wanted to acknowledge that I feel incredibly honored that some of the greatest living poets have been my mentors and my family. Alberto Rios, Lyra Van Cleef Stefanen, Alice Fulton, Richard Seiken, all of whom have influenced my work. It's a lot to live up to, and I welcome the challenge. I'm now going to read 2 triple sonnets from my latest collection, Return of the Chinese Femme. I actually just got the box over the weekend, and so it's great to hold the book. And so 2 triple sonnets for you all today. This first one is about one of my queer icons. It takes me back to my childhood. It's about Dennis Rodman, my favorite basketball player of all time. I don't do sports, but I understand basketball aesthetically. We'll just say that. Triple sonnet for Dennis Rodman, number 91 on my television screen. I tell R that McDonald's has sold out of the special $6 celebrity wrapper meal, and it's a moment straight out of my 90s childhood when Michael Jordan had his own burger. The McJordan with smoked bacon, cheese, and barbecue sauce. And don't forget the onions. And don't you wish your beloved will call you nicknames like McGorgeous or McLovely, or at least McPretty? And I wonder if names like that are reserved for run-of-the-mill white guy doctors/actors on TV shows past their prime. All I know is I'm mad my meal is sold out. All I know is Dennis Rodman was my favorite Bulls player as a kid. And how I remember his green hair on the court. Or what about when he dyed it yellow with leopard spots? Or the time it was a smiley face in the back and he really was a performer, even a dancer. And who could forget when he declared he was going to marry himself, showing up to Barnes and Noble in a wedding dress and a parade of Bifonen behind him? Cheers to you, Dennis, and thank you for giving me a childhood. January 2nd, 1998, when you hit 3 3-pointers in a row. Give me a triple-triple. At fast food joints, everyone asks for a double-double, but why ask for 2 when you could have 3? And we all know thrice is even nicer, and how Spumoni ice cream isn't complete without cherry, and Neapolitan isn't anything without strawberry. And have you tried the astronaut version that's one hard block? But who wants it dry when you could be wet is the rhetorical question for every context. Give me a triple espresso with a triple-decker Dagwood with olives and on top, and oh Dagwood, you lucky fool, how did you ever score a babe like Blondie? Count your blessings. Give me a juicy pickle from the largest glass jar, appetizer, entree, dessert. The rule of three applies to meals the most, or I'll take a triple topping pizza, anchovies, sausage, and olives, throw in a soda to wash it all down. 3 wishes. Triple sonnet for black hair. My mother warns me not to blow dry my hair too hard, turning it from black to rust. And I must wear my black hair proudly. Black, the color of clothing my grandmother hates, because young women should always wear red or pink, the colors of luck and youth. Black, the color of wedding dress the reality TV starlet circa 2006 wants, but she knows walking down the aisle in black will break her mother's heart. In fact, red is the color of wedding dresses in Chinese culture. Even if the bride wears white for the ceremony, she'll change into red for the dinner. Hello, 10-course meal of my dreams that starts with a meat platter of roasted pork, and how guests go crazy for the abalone and swallow's nest soup with crab meat. And of course, there's a chicken, a pig, a fish, a duck, and a lobster roll call. In fact, at Chinese funerals, relatives of the deceased don't wear black but white. In fact, 8's the lucky Chinese number, not 7. And at dim sum, my grandmother makes sure she orders 8 dishes, not 7, but 9's all right too. 8, like the number of legs on a spider. A spider, black like my hair, that my mother warns me not to blow dry too hard, turning it into rust. And I remember my 6th grade science experiment of lighting a cigarette, watching how the smoke changed the spider's web spinning. And black because it's hypnotic, like black dresses on gorgeous women, or how I prefer my lingerie in black over white. But red is probably the best, an ode to sexiness, an ode to the color of my culture and history. And I want to feel like the $1 million, be the $1 million, and black, the color of my late dog Buzzy, a Skye Terrier, twice as long as he was low. My mother once joking he looked like a giant rat, or a licorice bunny, or a furry snake, or a dragon in some iterations of love, majestic in dreams. How I miss him after these dream visits. Black, the color of my wet hair in the morning. Thank you.
Hello all, I'm a student in Dr. Chan's class. I will be reading 3 poems today, all of which I wrote in their classes. These poems center around the theme of they're all trans poems, but more than that, they're all poems about transformation. And this first one is called Double Sonnet for the Alchemical Dissolution of Womanhood, Transmutation Ritual. Transmutation was a word used in alchemy that has used to mean to change any metal into gold, but it has come to mean since then to boil something down to its purest essence and to transform it. Double sonnet for the alchemical dissolution of womanhood, transmutation ritual. If I could choose, I'd bruise like a street fighter and not an overripe peach. I want to feel the fibers of my being stretched taut as a bowstring just before an archer fires. I want to feel fire, release this thing squirming in my chest, let this thin skin burst like a grape skin when you sink your teeth in. But I don't mean those plastic bag store-bought grapes coated in chemical dust, lackluster. No, I mean the bunches Dionysius dangled over satyrs' lips while wood nymphs gripped each other by the roots and writhed. Rough bark and rougher bite serpentine. I'll coil and unwind. I'll swallow the moon to prove I am more Ouroboros than woman. I'll shapeshift in slow motion each new moon. I revel in the sanguine sensation of needle-piercing quadricep, deeper than skin, yet not quite bone deep, and I let the burning ache consume me. A moth licked by the flame. Hedonist, you'd understand what I mean when I say there is pleasure in this pain, there is liberation in stretching the untruth of anatomy, until it snaps like a beam of light, cut clean and sharp as a peach slice with a cheap knife, drawn and quartered. Sever me from womanhood. Let me bleed and bloom. Let me bruise. The second poem is called Fawn It is a character poem that I wrote in Dr. Chan's class, and it is an exploration of the wildest, most free parts of myself. Fawn is a nature creature, a fiddle-headed fern-type forest fae, a changeling, always changing, nipping at the heels of his mother, nipping at rose hips, braiding flowers into his hair. His queer makes them say, she's such a tomboy, and it's cute until it's not, because at some point, Fawn was supposed to grow up and acquiesce as boys offer carefully cultivated flowers, not half as sweet as the wild clovers Fawn likes to keep tucked between his tongue and cheek. When Fawn asks why his shifting shape has started to feel like a grapevine's fruit-choked death grip, his mother tells him not to worry. Most girls feel that way at your age. You'll settle into your body eventually. Fawn wonders if his spirit will settle like the dead leaves in the gutter last autumn. Fawn wishes he was not an unsightly shrike among his mother's roses, but Fawn will never be all honey like his mother. He's mostly blackberry tart and sweet nothings, and he yearns to flit swift as a meadowlark free, to sing like a chickadee, say, hey, sweetie, sweetie, in the spring, and to bloom femboy, bloom flower boy with witch hazel eyes, marigolden sunflower eyes, green fairy rings round the edges, rosy cheeks like robin's breasts. But time unfurls like a fiddlehead fern, and Fawn does not bloom. If you asked him, he'd tell you, 4 years old was the wildest I'll ever be. I was snarling, half howling, while my mother plucked burdocks and feather down from my tangly braided tree root hair. Back then, he didn't care about anything except catching cicadas, didn't care he was tomboy, only cared he was fairy, ferocious, feral, free, and last spring, Fawn fell for a dryad called April, a sugar maple girl burning burgundy, fiery like the leaf piles he used to love to leap into when he was young. And when Fawn kissed her on that gravel road at 1 a.m. in the dirty back seat while the Leonids peaked and coyotes howled in the distance, he felt his wildness stir again, awakening from hibernation under his skin. All rose bark and thorn bite, Fawn is a sapling seeking sunlight, seeking to transcend the dark forest floor, refusing to stay buried beneath loam and leaf litter. Fawn tells his mother, shapeshifters never settle, never plant their truths in the ephemeral. Fawn is nature creature, a fiddle-headed fern-type forest fae, a changeling always changing, shape-shifting into fawn freckled sylvan, snarl-haired and rose-hipped, and as time unfurls like a fiddlehead fern. Fawn blooms amarantha. This final poem is an exploration of the purest form of self, similar to the first one, through a dream. It's titled In a Mirror in a Dream. Framed in a mirror in a dream, this form is art. It puckers rigid lunar crescents crisscrossing this chest, ridges of pearly grooved ribs unhinged. Open like clam's lips, open like a wound. Torso contorted as if commissioned to unsculpt Venus. And bearing resemblance to my sister's Venusian torso, I remember how the flock of stick and poke birds hovered, rippled across her rib cage before she went under. How she feared the dark water. How she almost drowned there, free diving in an attempt to transcend the barriers of her skin. And in the mirror of my mind's eye, I dissolve formless. My form aches to be sculpted by forceps and scalpel under anesthesia like dark water. I'd loosen my death grip on reality and transcend the barriers of this skin in sterile alchemical dissolution, surgically excise the parts of me that are not me. In the mirror, in the dream, I see, then I tug and I froth and I snap and I break the surface and I breathe. I remember the bodies of those stick and poke birds, how they quivered like the pulsing roots of stars when she came up for air. Transmutation feels like dying or molting, a shedding of skin of self. No, the parts of me that are not myself, excised in rapturous ecdysis, transformed, until this form is the art form framed in the mirror. Thank you.
My wife and I attended the very first of these Frost events, and we've been to just about all of them since. So I've had a lot of time to get ready for this. I'm used to being out there with you, and I have a little bit of nerves right now. But I have to say that Max's reference in his introduction to a fragile poet in his mid-80s has me just a little bit anxious. I'm going to read 3 short poems. The first 2 I dedicate to Nadine St. Louis, Dina. She was a friend, a colleague, a poet, a fellow member of the Indian Head Track Club, and for a time, the chair of the Department of English. First, the first poem is by William Stafford. Stafford was born in Hutchinson, Kansas, but most of his life was spent teaching at Lewis and Clark College just east of Portland, Oregon. Dina was born in Oregon, and she let you know it all the time. In fact, we always mispronounced it. She said, we say Oregon. She says, no, it's Oregon, Oregon. She was very certain about that. The poem is set in a car driving across Kansas. My family slept those level miles, but like a bell rung deep till dawn, I drove down an aisle of sound, nothing real but in the bell, past the town where I was born. Once you cross a land like that, you own your face more. What the light struck told a self. Every rock denied all the rest of the world. We stopped at Sharon Springs and ate. My state still dark, my dream too long to tell. The second poem is right here. The second poem is called Diagnosis by Sharon Olds. I think it's an impish sort of poem, and that's exactly what I remember about Dina. She was sort of an impish lady. By the time, Diagnosis by Sharon Olds. By the time I was 6 months old, she knew something was wrong with me. I got looks on my face she had not seen on any child in the family, or the extended family, or the neighborhood. My mother took me into the pediatrician with the kind hands, a doctor with a name like a suit size for a wheel, Hub Long. My mom, that's a joke. My mom did not tell him what she thought in truth, that I was possessed. It was just those strange looks on my face. He held me and conversed with me, chatting as one does with a baby. And my mother said, she's doing it now. Look, she's doing it now. And the doctor said, what your daughter has is called a sense of humor. Oh, she said, and took me back to the house where that sense would be tested and found to be incurable. And the last, Robert Frost famously said on many occasions at talks like this, presentations like this, writing free verse is like playing tennis without a net. Thomas Hardy, who I'm going to read in a moment, never thought to say that, but in many of his poems, the rhyme schemes and the meter suggest he envisioned a volleyball net. He had a high bar. Here is Thomas Hardy's poem, A Sheep Fair, a Frostian setting with rhyme. A Sheep Fair by Thomas Hardy. The day arrives of the autumn fair, and torrents fall. Though sheep in throngs are gathered there, 10,000 all, sodden with hurdles round them reared, and lot by lot the pens are cleared, and the auctioneer wrings out his beard and wipes his book bedrenched and smeared, and rakes the rain from his face with the edge of his hand as torrents fall. The wool of the ewes is like a sponge with the day-long rain, jammed tight to turn or lie or lunge, they strive in vain. Their horns are soft as fingernails. The shepherds reek against the rails. The tied dogs soak with tucked in tails. The buyers' hat brims fill like pails, which spill small cascades when they shift their stand in the day-long rain. Postscript. Time has trailed lengthily since met at Pummery Fair, those panting thousands in their wet and woolly wear, and every flock long since has bled, and all the dripping buyers have sped, and the horse auctioneer is dead, who going, so often said, as he consigned to doom each meek, mewed band at Pummery Fair. Just in case you're worried, the shepherds who reek against the rails didn't stink. Reek means they smoked, they were smoking. But shepherds of the 19th century weren't particularly partial to hygiene, so they probably did stink.
I think, Miss Chris, it's your turn now. It's coming across the state. I think I told you that Fritz, well, you can tell the story of Fritz and Robert Frost,
Okay.
but I'm going to tell one story about you. If we were on the other side of the state, the age that many of us are, you would know who Miss Chris was, even if you hadn't been here before. If you ever watched a show called Children's Fair, and you would know that she was this is probably not something you particularly want to hear, but was called one of the pioneers of children's television. Okay, and also, I'm happy to introduce the former Princess of Storytelling Princess, which was her role on Children's Fair.
Well, I thought he was going to say that I started a style that today is very popular. My trademark as a princess up in the castle was a long curl, came down to here, thick. And it was my hair. It isn't like today where it's sewed on. And my rather sophisticated, snooty sister-in-law kept saying, "Why don't you cut your hair like everybody else?" And I said, because, well, number one, my father liked long hair and I'm kind of lazy. And I like to comb my hair once a day, not 6 times. Well, there was once, about 8 years ago, a picture of a model, and she was holding out her long braid. But enough about that old lady. I truly wish I were young again, because there is so much to do and I can't do it. I can't save the public schools all by myself. I used to go out and go to those meetings. I can't save the water from Perrier Nestle's anymore, but you people can. You can do a lot. And that is kind of my wish and my story to you. And thanks to this good man, who is a connoisseur of coffee, I'm here. And truly, the couple behind you, the good doctor, if he hadn't taken the pile of Robert Frost from his sister, my neighbor, and brought it here, Robert Frost would not be here. Now I just have to get rid of Faulkner and Hemingway and a couple of others. I was thinking, what can I say today? And maybe this will be the last time, you never know. I'll be 94 this July 4th, and that's climbing up there. But my best friend just celebrated her 108th birthday. Joan Robertson, a name that is pretty famous. She was one of the Klotchies in Milwaukee, but she worked with Eleanor Roosevelt on peace and on United Nations. And we still go to the public schools and have a United Nations Day. And I'm still participating, but I have a tough time reading the paper and calling some of the people that are there and getting people aroused to save our democracy. It is on the brink. Now, but I want to talk about Robert Frost, and I went through some of this and I thought, Robert Frost is still alive today. I took the Milwaukee Journal out. Of course, the obituary page was on this side, but on the opposite side, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He'll not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake. The darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask, is there some mistake? The only other sound is the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. And you know, I should have left this to be the end of my talk, because then I could have just taken a mile and sat down. I thought there are so many things that you haven't said and others haven't said about Frost. But I looked through, he was so far ahead of himself in thinking. When we all looked up at the stars and at the sun and didn't blind our eyes if you had glasses, he wrote about that. He wrote about so many things. And if I can find them now, here it is. I thought that instead of reading more of Frost's poetry, and by the way, this event, part of the deal was it should be every year, whether I'm here or not. And I'm kind of reprimanding a couple of people that if I wasn't expected, then my son should have been notified so he could have come, or someone from the family, or my brilliant daughter, if she's in a personality that day, that would be good. But this day, that was part of the deal. And my spirit will come down or up if you don't do it. Now, I thought some of you know, but many of you don't. Who was this Fred Schmidt? Who was this man who was so close to the poet? And how did he ever get there? Fritz was a very shy 17-year-old at Dartmouth. He didn't drink, smoke, and carouse like others. And he went to the library. He studied, he listened to music. He loved to write, not write poetry, but read it. And one day, the librarian said, "Hey, Fritz, there's somebody I'd like you to meet up in my study." So he said he trudged up these back wooden stairs, opened the door, and there, sitting in a rocking chair faced the other way, was Robert Frost, the poet. After the first shock, Frost and Fritz, this old man and this young 17-year-old, bonded. Why? They were both a little reticent in themselves. They both loved poetry. They both loved nature. And the two of them walked the outskirts of Dartmouth every night. And Fritz said, "Well, I'd ask a question, and Frost would expound." And when Fritz went off to the 10th Mountain Recon Troop War, Frost kept track. Frost got his book signed. Frost gave him the book written in England because he knew that Fritz couldn't afford it. He wrote to his parents and got their books that Fritz had and wrote in them. You see some of them in the back. Why would this old man do this for this kid? Well, it was because they both loved nature. They both were a little shy, and they both wanted a better world, and they wanted to make it. And that really is the reason that that exhibit is here, because this university and this community is the kind of community and the kind of nature that Frost would want and Fritz would want. As I was driving up from Milwaukee this morning and this afternoon, as I got out of Madison and Milwaukee and came up through the woods to almost Alma, is it Alma's Junction? I used to tell the kids at school, "You guess my middle name and I'll give you a gift." They never did. I hated my middle name. It was Alma. But today it's something else. But getting back to Fritz, when he was off at the war, Frost kept track, and Fritz was sent to the hospital instead of having going to the 10th Mountain Recon troops in Italy, where they climbed the mountain and attacked the Nazis from the top. It was the winning battle of the war, but almost all of them were killed. And that's what this poem that Frost wrote about Fritz comes from. And I don't know even if I can find it here, so maybe I won't read it. I felt my standpoint shaken. Well, that's another one. Just a minute. Wait a minute. If I come back and you invite me next year, I'm going to get organized before I come. I thought I could do it on the way up, but I was driving and I got lost about 4 times. And you know, when you're my age, well, here it is. One step backward taken. Not only sands and gravel were once more on their travel, but gulping, bloody, muddy gallons, great boulders off their balance, bumped heads together dully, and started down the gully, whole capes caped off of slice. In slice, I felt my standpoint shaken in the universal crisis. Couldn't it still be today a universal crisis? But one step backward taken going to the hospital, I saved myself from going. A world torn loose went by me, and then the rain stopped and the sun came out to dry me. And I'm going to take one more step, and this is probably more for me than you, but you'll have to bear with me. When Fritz died, when he passed, I asked Jay Scriba, who was the top writer at the Milwaukee Journal, and incidentally, first was hired by my husband when he started the Let's See magazine, which turned into the Milwaukee magazine, and he needed a new editor. And Jay Scriba, who lived up at Marquette during the summer, he had some problem with crowds, so he had to come to Milwaukee for therapy every month. And he thought, oh, this guy wants a job. So Jay came up and Fritz said, here came this guy with baggy pants and a hole in his shirt, and he wanted to apply. And he told me, why? Well, my wife needs to come down here every week. And so I thought maybe I would. Fritz said, do you have any reference? He said, well, yeah, I got a little. So he went back to his car. He brought this box of clippings that he had written, just filled. Fritz looked at them, read a few, and he said, you're hired. He hired them. And Jay was with him. Jay started writing little clips for the Milwaukee Journal. And eventually, Jay was hired away and became their very greatest writer. But if Fritz hadn't looked in that box and seen the genius, it wouldn't have happened. And that again is what relates to why Fritz was given a credit card from the biggest book company in New York and told, well, if you haunt the little bookstores and you find something that you think we would like, buy it. And he did. But can you imagine giving a credit card to a young man today that you really don't know? I'm telling you that because it says what kind of a man Fritz was, and in turn, the relationship he had with Frost, both of them inward, both of them seeing visions that we don't see. But now, getting back to Jay Scriba, I'm going to read the obituary, the writing he gave for the funeral memorial. I said, would you write something? And he did. Fred Schmidt, June 2005. Fritz, yes, but nobody called him Freddie. Rather the sort of young guy who bounced out of bed in the to do 100 push-ups in his pajamas. And one dawn, when his heart started fibrillating, instead of calming and calling an ambulance, he sat at his desk and, forever part Yale lawyer, meticulously wrote out his last will and testament. Among other things, what to do with such personal treasures as the affectionately signed poem his Dartmouth friend Robert Frost wrote about his World War II ski troop service. Well, by this time his heart had calmed, permanently as it turned out, enabling him to heed his exasperated doctor's plea to start the day less explosively. He could also be irresistibly convincing, a handy talent. When the burglar alarm sounded in the dress shop below his downtown apartment, just as he, festooned with piston chokes and climbing rope, was stumbling into the grip of Milwaukee cops who somehow had never heard of the wonderful rock climbing at Devil's Lake. Good Fred, dear Fred, dead serious, relentless Fred. He'd focused vision on a classy little Milwaukee magazine, reflecting the best of everything, from the flossier arts to the city's world-renowned industrial craftsmen. His always avid professional interest dwelt upon the city where he spent his workaholic life. But its deepest self was that of a countryman, a mud boots weekend farmer with the Thoreauvian love of Wisconsin land and forms. What else on his deathbed would buy an extra 80 acres of land just to ensure that 40 years from now, loggers would not be ruining it? He had planned his legacy, land now passed the Mississippi Nature Conservancy. Why didn't he stick with the law and become a legend? I've no doubt he could have. Why didn't he stick with his elite 10th Mountain ski troops? I see at least a bird colonel saluting. Why didn't he accept the offered job of president of his family's nationally famous printing company? I see a graph rising. Why didn't he write more himself instead of hiring writers? A puzzle, as I think that might have been his highest and best use, with a nifty New York style and balance. Well, we never asked him, he never said. I think he just took his life where he wanted, for which so many are grateful. And I think with that you'll understand why the Robert Frost collection is important to me, because it's part of my husband's legacy and wish. And Robert Frost can be alive for each and every one of you. And you better start working to save our democracy. I don't clap yet. I have to apologize. Some of you know, I wear this hat every day. I've worn it every day since the pandemic started. I'm at St. John's part of the time, and back then it was important you cover your face. Well, some of these old ladies forget or they didn't care, but they'd see this hat coming down and they think, oh, that old battle axe, and they'd cover their nose. And so I have decided I'm going to keep this hat on until this pandemic leaves. I hope the day will come that I can take it off. And I'm sorry I look as I do. I was going to stop at the Lismore and put on a face and comb my hair and, you know, but I didn't. I simply got out of bed this morning, did what I had to do, got in the car, got lost, and then got lost again, and then got lost again. I don't think it has anything to do with age. I got lost years and years ago. So thank you for coming, and remember, we have work to do.
You look beautiful.
It's
You look
okay.
beautiful. It's wonderful.
Well, you know, one of these days I'm gonna plan a talk and I'm gonna get up here and I'm gonna read it.
I don't believe you.
Well,
It was perfect.
thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for getting here on time. Don't you have a few words to say? You should, you know.
I always-
with the chance.
I always- So my eyes are dilated, so I've been squinting all while the sun is coming through. And you know how long it takes to get a doctor's appointment rescheduled these days? So my apologies for being late. I've never missed one. I want to thank all of the organizers, including the library who helped underwrite this, English department. I want to thank all of the guest readers who shared either their work or works of people they admire. And Ms. Chris, this is something I look forward to each year, and I got here as fast as I can. And I told her quietly, you maybe didn't hear me, I said, I, for one, think she looks beautiful, just so you know.
Well, thank you all for coming. I guess that we're done. There might be something that you could drink, eat. There's some rare Frost manuscripts in the very back if you didn't see those coming in. And be well, read, write, and see you next year.